The Third Reich is often remembered for its many atrocities, but it also had many strange and bizarre innovations that we still use today. In fact, there are some things that we take for granted in modern warfare that were created by Nazis. So today we are going to look at 10 of the most bizarre Nazi innovations that are still used today. Number 10, the Stasi. Today, if you want to be a spy, you can sign up for one of the many spy training courses online. However, these don't compare to the kind of training that spies of the past underwent. This was especially true of those who worked for the Stasi, which was the East German secret police force that operated from 1950 until 1989. The organization spied on everyone, even other spies. To do this, they employed many tactics that are still used by spy organizations today, and in fact, the CIA even had a department dedicated to studying the Stasi so they could learn from them. Many of their methods were highly effective and still remain classified today, but one of the more well-known tactics that the Stasi employed was the use of agents provocateurs. These were people who infiltrated opposition groups and then encouraged them to commit illegal acts. Once they had enough evidence, they would then arrest the ringleaders and break the group up. The CIA eventually set up a similar program called the Kubart Academy, which trained agents on how to best infiltrate groups and gather intelligence. Number 9. Rocket warfare. During World War II, Germany made extensive use of rocket warfare. One of the most famous of these rockets was the V2, which was the world's first long-range ballistic missile. It was able to travel over 200 miles per hour and was accurate enough to hit targets within 100 feet of its intended destination. Although it was never used on civilian targets, it did cause massive damage in London and Antwerp, where around 25,000 civilians were killed or injured. While it's no longer being used today, the technology has certainly advanced since then. And in fact, many of the missiles being developed during World War II were just recently declassified. Some of these missiles can travel multiple times faster than the speed of sound and can reach targets thousands of miles away. In fact, some experts believe that the US has missiles that could travel all the way to Russia within 15 minutes. Number 8. Poison gas. During World War I, poison gas was used extensively on the Western Front. In fact, it's estimated that more than 120,000 soldiers died as a result of gas attacks. But despite this, it wasn't used much during World War II until Hitler decided to invade Russia. The German High Command felt that the winter weather in Russia would protect the gas from evaporating and that it would be much more effective against the Russians. But this turned out to be a bad assumption, as the Soviets were able to develop gas masks that protected them from the elements while still being lightweight and comfortable to wear. But although Hitler's plan failed, poison gas continues to be used today in different forms. For example, the US has developed a weaponized form of anthrax that can be released from a plane and infect large areas of people. But perhaps even more terrifying is the fact that there are currently rumors that Russia is developing their own biological weapons as well. Number 7. Submarines. Submarines have been around since the mid-19th century, but it wasn't until World War II that they started to become more popular. The Germans were especially fond of submarines as they were able to build some of the largest ones during the war. These submarines, known as U-boats, were designed to stay submerged for long periods of time and were able to travel great distances without being detected. They were also armed with torpedoes and were capable of sinking entire merchant ships in a matter of minutes. The U-boat campaign against the Atlantic convoys was one of the most successful military campaigns of the war. In fact, at one point the U-boats controlled the Atlantic and the British were struggling to keep any of their ships afloat. But the U-boats weren't just useful during the war, as they're still being used today. In fact, many of the modern submarines are much more advanced than the ones that were built during World War II. Some of them can travel at speeds of over 30 knots and are armed with nuclear-tipped missiles that can reach targets hundreds of miles away. Number 6. Armored vehicles. Armored vehicles have been around since the beginning of warfare. Early examples include chariots and samurai armor, but it wasn't until World War II that they really started to become popular. The Germans were again at the forefront of this technology, as they were able to build some of the most heavily armored vehicles of the war. One of the most famous of these vehicles was the Tiger I tank, which had over 1,000 units produced during the war. It was designed to be a powerful weapon that could break through enemy lines and was armed with an 88mm cannon that could penetrate more than 100mm of armor. Today, there are many different types of armored vehicles in use, but most of them are designed for a different purpose. For example, some of them are designed to protect against small arms fire, while others are designed to withstand artillery bombardments. There are even some vehicles that are designed to protect against chemical weapons. But regardless of what they're designed for, they all share one thing in common: the ability to protect the occupants from harm. Number 5, flares. Flares have been used for centuries, but it wasn't until World War II that they really started to become popular. The Germans were again at the forefront of this technology, as they were able to produce some of the brightest and longest-lasting flares of the war. These flares were used for a variety of purposes, including illuminating targets, marking drop zones for paratroopers, and creating diversionary attacks. But the Germans weren't the only ones using flares during the war, as the British also developed some very effective flares of their own. The British flares were used for a similar purpose, but they also had the added benefit of being able to confuse German radar systems. Today, flares are still being used for many of the same purposes. For example, they're often used in counterinsurgency operations to help identify enemy positions. They're also used in some air shows to add a little bit of flair, pun intended. But perhaps even more importantly, they are still being used in military parades to add a little bit of extra flair to the proceedings. Number 4, proximity fuses. Proximity fuses have been around since the beginning of the 20th century, but it wasn't until World War II that they really started to be used extensively. The Germans were once again at the forefront of this technology, as they were able to produce some of the most accurate proximity fuses of the war. These fuses were used on a variety of weapons, including bombs and artillery shells. They were designed to detonate when they came within a certain range of their target, making them very effective against fast-moving targets such as aircraft. Today, proximity fuses are still being used, and they've actually become even more popular. In fact, many modern weapons are equipped with proximity fuses, including air defense, missiles, and anti-aircraft guns. This is because they're simply a very effective way to engage targets that are constantly moving around. Number 3, aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers have been around since the early 20th century, but it wasn't until World War II that they really started to be used extensively. The Japanese were at the forefront of this technology, as they were able to produce some of the largest and most powerful aircraft carriers of the war. These carriers were used for a variety of purposes, including providing air support for ground troops and attacking enemy shipping. The Japanese aircraft carriers were some of the most important assets of the Japanese Navy during the war, and they played a major role in many of Japanese victories. But although the Japanese were the ones who really started to push the limits of aircraft carrier technology during World War II, it was the Americans who would ultimately master it. The US Navy has been operating aircraft carriers ever since, and they continue to be one of the most important assets of the Navy. In fact, aircraft carriers are still being built today, and the newest ones are larger and more powerful than ever before. Number 2, the Germans were at the forefront of this technology, as they were able to produce some of the most powerful and effective landmines of the war. These mines were used for a variety of purposes, including defending against enemy advances and disrupting enemy supply lines. The Germans also developed some very effective methods for using landmines, such as laying them in large numbers along roads and railway lines. Today, landmines are still being used in many parts of the world. In fact, there are an estimated 100 million landmines buried in the ground at any given time. This is a serious problem, as landmines often do and explode when they are first encountered, and they can sit in the ground for years, sometimes decades, before they're detonated accidentally. This is why there are now international laws against using landmines, but unfortunately, there are still many countries that use them. Number 1, radar. Radar has been around since the beginning of the 20th century, but it wasn't until World War II that it really started to be used extensively. The Germans were once again at the forefront of this technology, as they were able to produce some of the most advanced radar systems of the war. These systems were used for a variety of purposes, including detecting enemy aircraft and tracking enemy ships. The Germans also developed some very effective methods for using radar, such as using it to direct anti-aircraft guns. Today, radar is still being used for many of the same purposes. In fact, radar is now used in weather forecasting as well. But perhaps even more importantly, radar is still being used in military applications. For example, it's used in air traffic control, and it's also used in some newer weapons systems. Thanks for watching. Do you know of any other bizarre Nazi innovations that are still being used today? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one.